The guest speaker for the day is Dr. YSR Murthy, who is the Vice Chancellor of RV University. Sir, we are extremely grateful for your presence, and here is a hearty welcome to you. I once again welcome you all.
Thank you, Sharanya. Before we move forward with today's topic, what ails our national human rights institution and what can civil society do about it? I would like to invite Ms. Margaret Sampath, Executive Director of SICRIM, to read us the profile of Dr. Murthy.
Good evening. Good evening and warm welcome to all of you for this online human rights discourse on what ails our national human rights institutions and what can civil society do about it. So, on behalf of St. Joseph's College and SICRAM, I'm very happy to introduce and invite today's speaker, Dr. YSR Murthy. So Professor Dr. YSR Murthy assumed charge as the first Vice Chancellor of RV University, Bangalore, recently. As a former civil servant from the 1985 batch of IAS and allied services, he held many responsible and sensitive assignments, including in the National Human Rights Commission, Prime Minister's Office, President's Secretariat, and Cabinet Secretariat. Between 2009 and 2020, Dr. Murthy steered the OP Jindal Global University during its rapid expansion phase as a part of its top leadership team as the registrar. He contributed its rise in international rankings and becoming an institution of eminence. Professor YSR Murthy has published several books, book chapters, and journal articles. He holds a bachelor and master degree in statistics from the University of Madras, MA degree in human rights from the University of London, and PhD degree from the Tamil Nadu Dr. Ambedkar Law University, Chennai. He secured university first rank in MSc and also the prestigious British Chevening Fellowship. Dr. Murthy has been elected as the Vice President of Indian Society of International Law for the 3-year term between 2018 and 2021. He is a national coordinator of SWAYAM, besides being a member of the Association of British Scholars. In 2019, Mr. Murthy was appointed as the Haryana State Higher Education Council. He is consultant by the government of Kerala, IGNOU, JNU, Delhi University, and some prominent human rights organizations. He is an advisor for the All India Network of NGOs and individuals working with national and state human rights institutions, INI, and is a part of the core group on anti-torture civil society coalition established by the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiatives. On behalf of St. Joseph's College and SICRAM, we welcome you, sir. I also welcome founder and former executive director of SICRAM, Mr. Matthews Philip, and I request him to facilitate the session. Over to Mr. Matthews Philip.
Time by way of an introduction, because I think the maximum time has to go to our respected speaker today. I only want to say that I feel humbled by this opportunity of sitting with Dr. YSR Murthy, moderating this particular session. And more than anything, you all have seen how impressive his curriculum vitae, the kind of positions that he has held in the past. And I want to say that he is one person, though an academician and a civil servant, but then we, the human rights community, always look forward to him for guidance and advice. And we had the good opportunity to work with him in several networks. Coming to today's topic, I just want to say only one thing, that we can't think of anybody else who can really authentically, and with all credibility to handle this particular topic, because he was right there. He was right there in the midst of the activities. So, sir, Dr. Murthy, I'm handing over the mic to you. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Matthew Philip, founder SICREM, and Executive Director SICREM, Ms. Margaret Sampath, and friends from SICREM and NGO sector, and students of St. Joseph's. A warm good evening to all of you. And it's indeed a pleasure and honor to speak with you this evening. Before I go further, I just want to put a disclaimer. When I say what ails NHRIs, you might feel that, I've already made a value judgment that there are some serious challenges. In fact, I will, structure my presentation in 4 parts. I will first explain to you what I mean by national human rights institutions. And second, I will explain to you what is the framework for evaluating them, and then go on to outline some challenges. And in the end, I want to take up what can civil society or general public or the youth of this country can do about this important issue. And the disclaimer that I want to make right in the beginning is that these institutions have done some creditable achievements. We must applaud them, we must salute them. They have been given a range of functions under their statutes. And in fact, so if I appear to be overly critical, so please remember this disclaimer. So there are things they have done, and for which we must give the due credit. But there is a lot more that can be done, and I speak from my personal experience of having served in the National Human Rights Commission for over 12 years, and all of us want to see a strong, independent, robust body for the protection and promotion of human rights of every one of us. And there's no harm in being self-critical if it helps in overall improvement. Now, if you look at the all aware of the National Human Rights Commission, and there are commissions for women, scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, minorities, persons with disabilities, Central Information Commission, etc. And many of them have commissions at state level. And if you add them, there are nearly 170 such institutions, and these can be categorized as national human rights institutions, and some of them owe their origin or their function, powers are described in the Constitution and are called constitutional bodies. For instance, you have the National Commission for Scheduled Castes, National Commission for Scheduled Tribes, while a few others are statutory bodies established under an Act of Parliament say the National Human Rights Commission or the National Commission for Women or the National Commission for Protection of Child Rights. And each of them has a very big mandate. And many of them have been given powers of a civil court. They have been given human resources, financial resources, and other resources to discharge functions entrusted to them. And many of these bodies had been in existence for nearly 3 decades or more, while a few of them, like Central Information Commission or the National Commission for Protection of Child Rights or SCPCRs, are relatively younger. So they have done many positive things for which we must sincerely thank their top leadership. And today, most of my remarks pertain to National Human Rights Commission, and wherever possible, I will compare and contrast other commissions. In fact, of the commissions which are present today, the National Human Rights Commission is regarded as a more powerful compared to the other bodies by having an investigative wing under its control and headed by a top jurist, etc. If you look at the Protection of Human Rights Act 1993, the preamble says it provides for the constitution of a National Human Rights Commission at the center, state human rights commissions in states, and human rights courts in districts for quote unquote better protection of human rights. Now let me raise a few questions. I know this format over a virtual meeting doesn't allow direct interaction, but when I raise this question, you know intuitively what the answer is. Are public expectations of these institutions being met? Are they fulfilling their respective mandates? Are they effective, independent, robust? Are human rights under threat, or are they flourishing? Are all human rights, by that I mean economic, social, cultural, as well as civil and political, are they available for all? In other words, are all human rights for all a reality or elusive? Is the current regime serious about the protection and promotion of human rights? Are there challenges in the human rights arena? Is there hate speech, hate crimes, racism, institutionalized racism, casteism, sexism, etc.? Of course, there are many such serious challenges. And before I go further, I just want to explain my second major point about the framework for evaluating these national human rights institutions. For instance, United Nations General Assembly in the year 1991 came out with what are called Paris Principles. These are basically guidelines about national institutions, and they talk about pluralism, diversity, wide mandate for the Commission, and autonomy, independence, and that this institution should be endowed with the necessary resources for carrying out their respective functions. So these are Paris principles, and which are supposed to guide the conduct of NHRIs, and NHRIs must keep them in view while undertaking their work. In addition to these Paris principles, there are functions which are mentioned in the respective statutes. For instance, if you see the section 12 of the Protection of Human Rights Act, it lists a number of functions, right from complaints handling to intervention in court proceedings, visits to prisons, mental hospitals and other such institutions, review of constitutional safeguards, laws, etc. So when you look at whether a particular NHRI has performed or not, we need to really compare and contrast its performance with the functions entrusted to it in this founding statute or Constitution of India or the Paris principles. Now, let me come back to the National Human Rights Commission again. First and foremost is the flaws in the founding legislation. When the Protection of Human Rights Act was what you call initially brought out in the year 1993, there were certain congenital defects. For instance, there is a certain provision with regard to the violations committed by police that NHRC can investigate them, whereas the violations by armed forces personnel have been put in a section 19, and where the commission can at best call for a report from the Ministry of Defense. It cannot, in other words, investigate the violations. The moment you define human rights as a right to life, liberty, equality, and dignity in the Protection of Human Rights Act, and then you cannot provide what you call a defect, like, for example, a limited mechanism for violations committed by a particular section. So these flaws, from time to time have been flagged, and by the civil society, by the National Human Rights Commission itself.
ഞാൻ ലോഗ് ഔട്ട് ചെയ്ത പിന്നെ ഞാൻ അതോടെ തീർന്നു ഇനി അറ്റൻഡ് ചെയ്യേണ്ട.
Hello. See, for Justice Venkatachalaya, as the chairperson of the second chairperson of the NHRC, in fact, he requested a former Chief Justice of India, Justice Ahmadi, to review the act. And in that committee, there were very eminent judges like Justice Rajendra Sachar and others. And they together suggested a number of important amendments, and these were made to the government by the commission so that the commission could become an effective body. But in the year 2006, a very few amendments were brought out, which did not reach anywhere. And recently, in 2019, the act was again amended, but it has not been able to remove many flaws. If you look at the amendments that were carried out in 2019, you will find that the legislation was introduced, let's say, in the month of July. Barely within 2 weeks, the legislation has been passed in a hurry. And what do you find? What are the kind of changes that have been made? Say, the chairperson was earlier on a former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of India. Now, that today, after the amendment, the chairperson of the NHRC can be either a former CJI or a former judge of the Supreme Court of India. Technically, you have expanded the pool of candidates for consideration, but it's like a downward momentum. Like if you see that commission's effectiveness is often synonymous with the person who is holding, like person who is heading the top leadership role, and some of the former chief justices who headed the commission, like Justice J.S. Verma or Justice Venkatachalaya or the first chairperson, Justice Rangnath Mishra, have done remarkable things to raise the profile of the commission. And so, if you see, there are a few more changes that have been done which are not really good ones. Like earlier on, there was a 5-year tenure. It has been reduced to 3-year tenure. And earlier on, there were 3 members from higher judiciary, 2 members from persons with expert knowledge in the field of human rights. but this too has persons with expert knowledge in human rights has been expanded to 3, which should include a woman, and it's good. So that way, right now, instead of 5 full-time members, there are 6, and earlier on, the chairpersons of the National Commission for Minorities, SCs, STs, and women were the deemed members. Now, 3 more deemed members have been added, but so in fact, a commission should be pluralistic in its character. It should represent a wide cross section of the public. And so today, like the National Commission for Backward Classes and what you call Office of the Chief Commissioner for Persons with Disabilities, or the chairperson of the National Commission for Child Rights, etc., have been brought in. But this is basically to ward off criticism from the international community. But on paper, there has been an exercise done for bringing pluralism or diversity, but in practice, I've seen how often statutory full commission meetings are conducted. Though change has been made in the legislation, nothing has been mentioned about the frequency at which these deemed members should meet, or the statutory full commission meetings must take place. So it is entirely left to the chairperson of the National Human Rights Commission whether to have the consultation with the deemed members or not. On the one hand, to ward off international criticism, to gain accreditation, etc. So the amendment has taken place, but in practice, it has not really made any difference. The commission has a wide mandate, but again, it is dependent on the top leadership, how you put that in practice. You can interpret human rights, the term human rights, in a maximalist manner or a minimalist manner. And if a body to which a lot of public expectations are aligned, for instance, they get 100,000 odd complaints in a year, and when such a body adopts a maximalist interpretation of human rights, you know what will happen to the general public. And when it adopts a minimalist interpretation, again, you know what are the harmful or consequences for the general public will be. I have already told you about the limited role with respect to the violations committed by members of the armed forces. Again, independence and autonomy. For example, the lot can be said about the independence and autonomy. Here, the framers of the Protection of Human Rights Act, that is the members of parliament, in their wisdom, have provided for grants, etc. Some provided for provisions for the independence, but unfortunately, in our country, we lack a culture of autonomy. We find that institutions often do not exercise autonomy. Even if they exercise autonomy, the nodal ministries to which they are tied do not allow such exercise of autonomy. So, for instance, there are many things which, if they want to expand their staff resources, supposing they find suddenly a huge increase in the human rights violations, they cannot increase the investigative staff, they cannot increase they need to seek approvals from the government. And similarly, there are many other constraints for the creation of posts, or so these act in a way, or they limit the effectiveness of the commission. Now, let me turn to another important provision, like let's say annual reports of the commission. The parliamentarians, in their wisdom, said the commission should provide an annual report And then the government of the day should place the annual report along with an action taken report. Now, if you look at the action taken reports very carefully, they are in a way action not taken reports. And they are basically why action cannot be taken. And if you look at more critically, the central government will be saying that this is a state subject and the action pertains to the state government. And quite often these annual reports, like say you take state commission for scheduled castes or commission for scheduled tribe or commission for minorities, their annual reports are placed before the parliament or they are submitted to the President of India, of course. They are placed before the Parliament with a big time lag. And there again, quite often one does not see full implementation of various recommendations made in those annual reports. And it's a tragedy that members of Parliament often do not discuss these reports. In fact, the government is supposed to, if it is not implementing a particular recommendation, it is expected to give a justification why it is not implementing, and all those things are rarely discussed, rarely debated. So there's a lot more that needs to be done to see that these annual reports are placed swiftly before Parliament and also made available to the civil society, made available to the general public, or more important, the recommendations made in these reports are implemented in practice. Now let me turn to another major problem, that is political appointees at the helm of affairs. And there is of course lack of transparency in this appointment process, and in the case of National Human Rights Commission, the selection committee for appointment of chairperson and members of the Human Rights Commission is supposedly a very high-level committee headed by none other than the Prime Minister of India. On paper, it looks like a politically balanced committee with the presence of leaders of opposition from the Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, but in practice, it is dominated by the ruling party. Once chairperson and members of the commission are appointed on political lines, can political interference be far behind? Can we expect these persons to be unbiased and act without any prejudice? In contrast, the appointments to the National Commission for Scheduled Castes, Scheduled Tribes, Women, Minorities are politically motivated in a very big way. The civil society has been crying hoarse that Paris principles must apply not only to NHRC but also to the other sister commissions as well. But it is unfortunate that this plea has not been taken seriously. Rarely are these posts of chairperson members advertised. The qualifications, both essential and desirable, are not disclosed. The general public do not know who all are under consideration. There are only very few exceptions of some noble men and women who got appointed to these bodies. Here I just want to explain, as I said, earlier on there used to be 5 members in NHRC. Of course, now it has been expanded. In those 5, there were 3 from higher judiciary, 2 from persons with expert knowledge in human rights. Now it has been expanded to 3. Invariably, government for a long time appointed 1 person from the Indian Foreign Service, 1 person from the Indian Police Service. Are these the only persons who are sole repositories of knowledge in human rights? What about the civil society activists who have been working for decades? What about academics who have developed expertise on the human rights jurisprudence? What about other eminent persons who have been, worked for decades in the field of human rights? Why are they not under consideration? By and large, these bodies are seen as rehabilitation centers for retired persons. Now that is at the level of apex leadership of chairperson and members. At the level of staff, a considerable portion come on deputation from the government, while some are recruited directly, particularly from the lower levels, there's a direct recruitment. Imagine, for instance, in the investigation division, a person who is working in a particular state police comes to the NHRC on deputation for 3 years, 4 years. Eventually, he goes back to his parent cadre. How can you expect this person not to be influenced by his seniors, his peers? How can you expect this person? Because eventually he has to go back to his parent cadre, and he is investigating for the commission. And while one day he has to get back to his parent cadre. So the NHRC, in other words, requires officers of its own to carry out independent investigations, and the government must enable it to recruit its own staff. There is one unfortunate case of extrajudicial executions in the northeastern state of Manipur, and the widows of those people who have been eliminated in fake encounters got together and formed an association called EFARM, Extrajudicial Victims Families Association, and they took this matter to the Supreme Court, and then Supreme Court passed on some interesting orders in this case, and they asked the NHRC. NHRC expressed its own helplessness. This is, imagine, about 1,500 extrajudicial execution over a decade or so of the conflict, and the commission was not willing to take the load, and in that context, Justice Madan Lokur, and in the course of a judgment, termed the NHRC as a toothless tiger. Because if you see the discourse, there are often references to paper tiger and toothless tiger, etc. In other words, it does not have, it's a recommendatory body. It does not have powers to penalize the offenders. Supposing, let's say, for a long time, the body was able to meet public expectations, give out recommendations for compensation, and then get its way recommendations filled. But see, supposing I have a wooden sword and I claim that it is a real sword and I brandish it, and in case and I tell some reluctant authorities to pay compensation or etc., etc., and often even the brandishing of a wooden sword leads to some positive results. Supposing the person who is brandishing a wooden sword says, I am having a wooden sword, who will take that person seriously? In fact, the chairperson of the commission himself categorized the NHRC as a toothless tiger at one point of time. So these are extremely important matters, because you as a recommendatory body not only make a recommendation but ensure that the recommendation for prosecution of the errant civil servant or public servant or compensation to the victim should get implemented in practice. So recently, there is, of course, in the month of February, 2 weeks back, there was a good judgment from the Madras High Court saying that a judgment from or a recommendation from the State Human Rights Commission should be enforceable. It comes as a breath of a fresh air, and I hope this judgment of the Madras High Court about the enforceability of State Human Rights Commission recommendation are applicable to the other State Human Rights Commissions and also to the National Human Rights Commission. And I hope the civil society takes it up and then moves the apex court for a similar recommendation, what we are talking is about human rights are about the limits that are placed on the use or abuse of the state power and which encroaches on the fundamental rights of citizens. These concern right to life, right to be free from torture, right to food, right to health, and such burning issues, and starvation. So when those are the when recommendations are made for amelioration of such burning human rights issues, it is but expected that this should be immediately implemented by all authorities to whom these recommendations are addressed. I can go on these challenges, but in view of the time limits, I will just now move on quickly to the what can civil society do about these challenges. Sikram has done a research study on the working of Karnataka Women's Commission some years back. Likewise, the NGOs, the civil society, academic institutions undertake a variety of audits of these public institutions. They can undertake a diversity audit, for instance, whether the commission has a representation for women or persons with disabilities or LGBTQI or various sections of the general public. Does it mirror? Do people from vulnerable sections have confidence to move such a body? They can also undertake a financial audit, access audit, functional audit. By that I mean a variety of functions are listed in their founding statutes. Are these institutions carrying out the mandate that is mentioned in the founding legislation or in the constitution? They can undertake, let's say, complaints handling. How many complaints are, for instance, what is the time frame taken for redressal of a single complaint? Is it 6 months? Is it 2 months? Is it 2 years? Or is it 10 years? And how many percentage of complaints are dismissed? How many are taken to with a positive recommendation? So there is many what you call angles for undertaking a full-fledged audit. And then the civil society can use media advocacy, legislative advocacy for law reform. India has signed many core human rights treaties. For instance, you take the Covenant for Civil Political Rights, or the Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, or the CEDAW, which deals with women's rights, or the Child Rights Convention, Disability Convention. So each of these treaties, and it is also reviewed under the Universal Periodic Review mechanism of the Human Rights Council. So the civil society can make use of the various options provided under the international treaty system to prepare a shadow reports to to the Human Rights Council or the various treaty bodies and report on the grassroots realities. Like, for instance, naming, shaming can lead to a betterment of human rights. Research, documentation is also extremely important, and then publication of these reports will have a salutary effect on the realization of human rights. So to sum up, I have explained to you what is meant by a national human rights institution and what is the framework for evaluating such a national human rights institution, and what are some of the challenges. Of course, one cannot exhaust the various challenges in the way of protection and promotion of human rights, but I have outlined some of the challenges, and I've also dealt with what can civil society or general public or academic institutions do about it. Human Rights Watch, which is a respectable non-governmental, international non-governmental organization, about a few decades back, brought out a report on national human rights institutions in the African continent. It evaluated some 20-25 NHRIs in Africa and came out with a report. The report is called Protectors or Pretenders, an evaluation of the NHRIs in the African continent. So here are a watchdog, it should not only what you call bare its teeth, bark, and it should, I mean, like it is supposed to be a bridge between government on the one hand and the civil society on the other, and it has a multiple functions entrusted to it under the statute. And but even when it performs, we must applaud them. When it doesn't perform, we must check them. For instance, about one decade back, there was one NGO which brought a complaint to the National Human Rights Commission on an occupational hazard called silicosis. The silica dust gets into the workers' lungs, and then there is no cure for it, and the migrant worker gets back and then eventually dies. And they brought a complaint when they found that NHRC was not doing much. They brought one day a big lock saying that they would like to put the lock to the National Human Rights Commission, which really shook up the commission, and it was made them swing into action. So the civil society can be a catalyst, can play a very constructive role, and seeing that we have a robust, independent, effective body for protection and promotion of human rights of citizens. And then with this, I wish to thank all the organizers for giving me an opportunity to interact with you. I'm open for questions, if any.
Dr. Murthy, we are indeed thankful to you for this informative session. Clayton Christensen once said, "Without good questions, good answers have no place to go." With this thought in mind, we will now be moving to the question and answer session, where the questions from the chat box will be answered. Any volunteer with doubts may raise their hands virtually and wait for their turn to speak. The first question for you, Dr. Murthy, is I read in an article the formation of human rights discourse concerning the evolution of structures in 3 areas of theoretical, philosophical, legal, normative, and executive political is required to be addressed. What are your views on this? Should I repeat it?
Yes, it's a very loaded question. Please repeat it. Yeah, if you don't.
Yes. So the questionnaire read it in an article. The formation of the human rights discourse concerning the evolution of structures in 3 areas of theoretical, philosophical, legal, normative, and executive political is required to be addressed. What are your views on this?
Oh, yes. We can theorize how a particular structure should be created. The human rights, of course, can be approached from a variety of disciplines, including sociological, philosophical, ethical, and political, and other perspectives. And whatever structures that we create, they must adhere to the normative standards accepted universally by the United Nations and its treaty bodies, as well as enshrined in our own constitution. And they should, so basically, in the end, they should matter to a person on the street, the common man on the street, whose rights are violated or infringed by the actions of the state. I hope it answers the question.
Yes. Did someone want to say something? Okay. Okay. So we'll move on to the second question. The controversies surrounding the rights and freedom which we are entitled to have complex sides and often depend on the justification used for recognizing the rights. The common justification used in defense of these rights is in our nature, which again triggers many other questions. Do we have unique attributes justifying the recognition of certain rights?
Yes, of course. It's again a very philosophical question. Um, the moment we are born as a human being, we are entitled for respect for our life, dignity, and so on and so forth. And these are initially in the literature called as a natural rights. And so this constitution and other laws merely recognize these rights which are inherent in every human being by virtue of mere birth in the human family.
Okay, thank you, sir. So the third question goes, who is to decide what the requirements of the state of nature are for purposes of forming the human rights law and how?
Okay, so here I want to outline one paradox which we witness in our lives. Um, who commits human rights violations? The state. So when I say human rights set limits on the use or misuse or abuse of state power whenever it encroaches on the rights of the citizens. Now, who judges whether at the international level, who frames the rules? For example, in the UN General Assembly, it is the 195 odd countries which together prepare international conventions, which basically are set of rules. And then, okay, the violations are committed by states and the rules are framed by states. And in the Human Rights Council, again, it is the states which judge whether the violations are okay or not okay. So you cannot have um, uh, be a judge of your own cause. For example, if a entity which commits violation were to judge its own actions, it ought to be judged by an independent, like a judicial or an expert body. I'm only talking about the international human rights law, UN and its mechanisms. So this is the paradox at the international level, where the violations are committed by the states, the rules are framed by the states through conventions, and again, the Human Rights Council is again comprises of the states parties. They sit in judgment over the violations and they review the records of human rights. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir. The fourth question goes, do human rights exist? If they do, are they universal, to be interpreted and applied in the exact same ways globally? Or are they relative, to be harmonized with the local religious, cultural, political, and other requirements?
Um, when I say this is a very old question, like whether universal or whether they are relative to a culture. Uh, in fact, those who want to deny human rights, we need to see who is making this argument that they are relative to a particular culture or context. Um, Humans everywhere are same, the same blood, whether they are black or white, whether they are from a religious minority or a majority, it's all the same. They are born with the same, what you call dignity, equality, respect for life, right to life, and all these. So there are certain things which are so what you call apparent that the moment a human being is born into the human family, they accrue various rights. But there are some who keep on arguing that um, the Asian context, they understand human rights differently, and they should be made relative to the Asian values or African values and so on and so forth. One needs to see whether is the in that context, for example, if only the ruling elites from a particular community were to make this claim that they are relative, and if supposing in this claim women are not represented, supposing for whatever reason, so these are basically excuses. In the 1993 World Conference on Human Rights resolved these conflicts and held that in the Vienna Declaration and Program for Action, that all human rights are universal, indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated. And so, for those who claim that human rights should be made relative to culture, one can find lot of arguments against it. For instance, you take an African context, a mother whose child is picked up and then tortured. Is the pain of that mother different from a mother in Asian context? So whether it is Bahamas to Burkina Faso to etc., it's the same thing, and it's a like the moment. Yeah, I hope I have made the argument. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. That makes complete sense. So now the questions that were put across are answered. I request the participants in the meeting to unmute, raise their hands, and unmute themselves and speak one by one if they have any questions. Does anybody have a question for Dr. Murthy? Or your doubts? Anything? Yes. Monojit Dev, you may unmute yourself and speak.
Hi, my name is Monojit De, and I'm from Meghalaya, Shillong. So, sir, my question would be, we face a lot of communalism and racism in the northeastern part of India. We had the state comprises of the scheduled tribe and scheduled caste, where general are minority here. So we don't get any job. We are always seen very low. In any place we apply, it's never anything that we get. It is always the priority of the people of this state. Though I am also a part of this state, but I don't have any rights here. So we're always, there is, people are assaulted. They are kept always low. So I have seen many cases going to the police station. There are brutal murders as well, but there are nothing has been taken care of by the administration, jurisdiction, nor any NGOs, nor any human rights commission. So how do we tackle this here? Because we feel very helpless.
Yeah, Mrunaljeet, I entirely share with your this saying that people from Northeast often face discrimination in their access to housing, or sometimes in their enjoyment to right to life, etc. and maybe because of the physical features or whatnot, it's unconscionable, and such racism should have no place in a civilized society. And the human rights structures like National Human Rights Commission, state commissions, and other bodies provide kind of a recourse, the courts. We need to spread awareness about it. Quite often we delude ourselves that we are a wonderful society, and there's no racism exists. All of us need to open our eyes and see what happens when a person belonging to a, let's say, a Muslim minority tries to seek housing within this thing, what kind of hazards they go through. And same is the case with people from Northeast. So we, as a society, we need to be cognizant, and the only change can come through better education, better awareness. And whenever there's a violation, you should not let it pass, but try and contest. And that's how in 2001 there was a Durban World Conference on racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. And I was working with the Human Rights Commission at that point of time. And the government of India then maintained that race and caste are two different things, and that racial discrimination doesn't exist in India. But NHRC at the time had a different view. It took an independent, contrary view and said the Constitution itself provides for prohibition of discrimination on various grounds, including caste as well as race. And so when we say all human beings are born free, equal in dignity and rights, whether regardless of the place of origin, all human beings are supposed to enjoy full range of human rights on par with others. And if there is any violation, that we need to approach, we need to work and ensure that such violations are eliminated, and we should move towards a better society where all human beings enjoy all human rights.
Absolutely, sir.
I think we've come to the end. Thank you, Dr. Murthy, for patiently answering all of our questions. We are grateful for the time and energy you spent on this. I now request Matthew Phillips, sir, to express his views or his thoughts about the topic.
Thank you. In fact, Dr. Murthy talked about the silicon activists making a lock for the MHRC. I should admit that I felt making locks many times. Of course, as Dr. Murthy said, correct. Not that we are saying that these institutions have not done anything at all. Definitely, they have a lot of things to their credit. But then, in my opinion, in my analysis, one thing that comes to my mind is that, of course, good things happened when there were good people at the helm of affairs. But when it comes to the commissions as institutions, unfortunately, it has failed us. It has happened because of the same the important points that Dr. Murthy has been explaining, like the problem of political appointments, the problem of plurality, from other departments, and so many other things, and also the weaknesses in the legislation itself. Why we criticize this? So all with the intention that it's only from an angle of improving things. It has to. It cannot remain the same. And for a human rights defender, even now the human rights institutions are the last resort. Of course, one may say court. I mean, of course, because you have so much of problems, that we are facing with the system of judiciary, we created these institutions. As Dr. Murthy said, we all feel definitely the civil society should play a major role in improving the situation, keep talking about the problems, and also send them complaints. And this friend from the Northeast, I also perfectly understand. In fact, we can have to involve in some of these cases of only on people from Northeast. I mean, the people of African, they also face similar issues. What I think, even when you feel helpless, please complain. Ultimately, things happen in your favor or not. Fill these institutions with your complaints. That will put pressure on them. And Dr. Murthy provided a lot of insights and food for thought. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Matthew. Thank you very much. And thank you, Ms. Margaret, and thank you, the organizers. It has been a pleasure interacting with all of you.
Thank you, Mr. Michael Philip. And thank you, everyone who participated. And to bid them their farewell is Shashidhar Bhatt. Over to you, Shashidhar.
A very good evening to one and all present here. Thank you all for patiently listening to this session and playing a vital role in making this event a success. I would like to express my deepest sense of gratitude to the guest speaker, Dr. YSR Murthy, for making time for this webinar. A huge token of gratitude goes out to the organizing team and the faculty for pouring in their time and effort in running this event smoothly. Big thanks to all the participants today for actively listening and interacting with us. Thank you all once again. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Murthy, once again. And volunteers, you may now leave the meeting. Thank you all for participating.
Thank you.